All right, everyone. Thanks for attending our webinar today. We've been doing these webinars during 2021. I think this must be the 7th webinar we've done on the first Wednesday of every month at 7 p.m. Thanks for coming out. Today we'll be talking about the blueprint for purchasing your first 5 properties. The session will run about 45 minutes, and then we'll have lots of time for Q&A after the event is over. So that if you have any specific questions, I'm happy to stay around. And in general, I usually find that the questions end around 8:15 or 8:30. So anybody that wants to stay right to the bitter end, feel free to send me as many questions as you have, and I will answer questions at the very end of the presentation. Feel free, of course, to put in questions into the Q&A, or if you can't figure out how to do that, you can also put it into the chat. So let's get started. There we go. So welcome to my presentation today. Here's our table of contents. I'll be going over creating your game plan, sorting out your residence, understanding the power of leverage, and understanding the different methods of growing your real estate portfolio. There's a number of different ways that you can grow a real estate portfolio, including purchasing residences, purchasing rental properties, or doing a bit of a mix. So I'll talk about the difference in leverage between those two strategies. What a HELOC is, it's a very important product for any investor. How to purchase properties number 2 and 3 and what's important and relevant for you when you're doing so. How lenders qualify rental properties, so how much income lenders use on rental properties. We'll be talking about purchasing properties number 4 and number 5. And at this point, it's important to talk about what the banks won't tell you or don't tell you. There's lots of pitfalls that people walk into without even realizing that there is a landmine there. And I'll summarize it with some quick tips and some tips on how to move forward. So let's move on here. For some reason, my clicker isn't working, so I'll have to just click on my screen. So first of all, step number 1, it's very important to create a plan. The number of clients that we talk to that don't have a game plan when they arrive, or don't work with us to create a game plan, it's very important to have one, and ideally to stick with it. The reason for this is that a phrase that I use a lot is begin with the end in mind. It's really important that you understand where you want to end up, because a game plan for, let's say that you're purchasing your residence, that's one specific type of financing that we would be arranging. If we know that you want to buy 1 rental property, then we may set up your residence slightly different. If you want to buy 5 properties, we might set up your residence completely different. And if your intention is to buy 5+ or get into commercial lending, that could be a completely different game plan altogether as well. So understanding where you want to end up is very, very important and very relevant. And one of the things that we find is a challenge. It can be very difficult to change the structure of your portfolio if maybe you hit property number 3 thinking you would never buy more than 3, and all of a sudden now you figure, oh, you know what, I actually want to buy 15 properties. Maybe you need to now incorporate, or maybe you need to change the way that you've been structuring your properties to get up to that level or that point. And we find that we're doing a lot of restructuring here in our office to better set up somebody for success to reach their new goals and objectives. So the clearer you are and where you want to be and where you want to take it really helps. And the reality is, it gets harder and harder and harder as you grow your real estate portfolio. And this chart or graph could be a reflection of how difficult it can be for you to build a real estate portfolio. In the very beginning, it's fairly easy, but as you continue to grow and build, it becomes more and more difficult. So the first thing, make sure that you set up a game plan and understand what that looks like. And that will help you, give you a bit of a framework for how you can end up arriving there. So step number 2, after you've created your game plan, is you should own your own home. Or if you already own your own home, step number 1 for you, or step number 2 after creating your plan, would be understanding how much leverage you can obtain on your home to access capital for investing. So first of all, why invest in real estate and own real estate at all? 90% of millionaires own their or made their first million in real estate. So that's why you should be owning real estate. And I think most of you that are here are probably either interested in investing in real estate, or have already been drinking the Kool-Aid and say, you know what, I already invest in real estate, or I really believe in that asset class. But this is an important stat to bring up, is that most millionaires became millionaires first through owning real estate. And sometimes it's as simple as somebody buying their own home and all of a sudden their value of their home goes up, or they buy 1 or 2 rental properties and the value of their home goes up. So most people do become millionaires using real estate as an asset class. So sometimes this does come up. Why should you own your own home? And in certain rare cases, it may not make sense for you to own your own home, but in most cases it would. And the most important reason for that is the power of leverage. And leverage is one of the most important aspects of investing in real estate. For instance, if you're buying a personal residence or a second home, you can buy with as little as 5% down. If you're buying a rental property, you can put as little as 20% down payment. So understanding this leverage concept is really, really key. There's not a lot of assets out there that you can put 5% down on and still own that asset. So it's a really important key to look at. If you're investing in stocks, for instance, most of the time, even if you have a really strong margin account, you're still having to put up a lot more cash than just 5% or 20% in those situations. And one of the reasons for that is that real estate is a very secure, solid asset. It is tangible. It's something you can feel. As some people that have been around the block for a long time, they say that you can grow vegetables on it. You know, you have full control over your real estate asset in most cases. And another important reason to specifically own your own home, so this doesn't apply to rentals, but it does apply to your own personal residence. There are no capital gains on appreciation of a residence. So any appreciation that occurs on your primary residence is not subject to tax, which is a really important key. In many other countries around the world, like the United States, for instance, your residence is subject to capital gains and subject to tax. And so this is a very relevant thing for Canada. And there is some talk that maybe moving forward, they may change this guideline. But as of now, a residence is not subject to capital gains, which is a huge reason that most people make the most money on their personal residence. It is usually the most expensive property in their portfolio. And therefore, because it's the most expensive, it appreciates the most. And because you have the most appreciation on it and you're not paying that tax on that appreciation, it ends up being, after accounting for tax, often the most efficient way of making money in real estate. I want to illustrate an example here of the power of leverage. So let's say that we're purchasing a property for $500,000 and we're going to buy a rental property. So we're going to put $100,000 down. And let's say that we see a 3% annual appreciation in the property. So the value of the home on $500,000 goes up by 3%. So it goes up by $15,000. So the question is, what is your return on investment? You've made $15,000 on your $100,000 down payment. So your return on your investment, if you've made 15 grand on $100,000, is actually 15%. So even though the property value only went up by 3%, keep in mind that you leveraged that asset by 5 times. You put 1/5 of the property value down, and so every 1% of appreciation is a 5% return on your money. Now, this can get a little bit crazy if you look at a personal residence. So the same property worth $500,000, if you put $25,000 down and the home appreciates by 15%, what's your return on investment? Anybody want to put that in the chat? I know I'm giving you guys math questions. Yes, Debbie. 60%. That's right. So the return on investment in this case is actually 60%. And that's because, again, you're making $15,000 on your $25,000 investment. Now, this is assuming a 3% appreciation. There have been times, like in 2015, 2016, and in certain assets in the last 12 months, where the appreciation has been 30% in just 1 year. And if you made 30% appreciation on a property that you put 5% down on, your return on investment over 1 year would be 600%. Now, that's an outlier, and I would never expect and anticipate somebody would have that kind of appreciation on an ongoing basis. Usually for my models, I use a 3% annual appreciation. But it is something to think about, is that the amount of money that you can make simply by having a home that appreciates over time because of the power of leverage, your return on investment is very, very strong. So regarding a a structure for how do you set up your first residence, what's the right way of preparing this? There are a couple of different directions that you can take actually with it. You could look at, let's say, doing 5% down. So if you're a first-time home buyer, in fact, I should clarify this, you do not need to be a first-time home buyer to put 5% down on a property. You just need to be purchasing your own personal residence. And so if you're purchasing your own residence because you don't own anything right now and putting 5% down, you would require a $105,000 income to do this. In general, the math is for every $100,000 you're borrowing, you need about $20,000 in income. On the lower end of the range, especially on 25-year amortization money, you need a little bit more than $20,000 per $100,000 you're borrowing. And you're going to find that if you were borrowing $1 million, you wouldn't need $200,000 in income. You need probably a little bit less. And depending on whether it was a 25-year or 30-year amortization, you might need $175,000 or $180,000 income. But in general, about $20,000 in income equals $100,000 in a mortgage. Now, one of the reasons that I'm putting the income required here is as we go along this process of purchasing your first property and then purchasing your first rental and your second rental and growing your real estate portfolio, I want to illustrate what happens to the required income because it will slowly increase as you build your real estate portfolio. Now, you don't have to just do 5% down, by the way. Another option, and there are some benefits to this, is to look at doing 20% down payment. And so if you're putting 20% down payment, the income required actually drops down because now you're only borrowing $400,000. And so now you only need an income of about $80,000 a year, which is one bonus. And you can also get a 30-year amortization on your mortgage, which lowers your payments, which will improve your future borrowing power. And perhaps more importantly, you can get a home equity line of credit, or a HELOC for short. Now, keep in mind, you do not need to just be purchasing a property because some of you here already own your own residence. And that means that step number one for you guys is actually to set up a HELOC on your primary residence. And so we're going to get into that in the next slide, but just keep in mind that there are a couple of different paths you can take. And some people are looking at building a real estate portfolio very aggressively. I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can actually buy rental properties with 5% down. There's a bit of a trick to it. Or you can look at buying with 20% down, and that is the method of being able to purchase with it's effectively a lower risk type of style of building a portfolio because you're always getting 30-year amortizations and you're building in a bit more of a cushion into your portfolio. But more importantly, with 20% down, you're getting home equity line of credit products. So I do want to illustrate how a home equity line of credit would work. So if we had a $500,000 property, and let's say that you currently have a $225,000 mortgage on it, what you can do is you can actually get a re-advanceable mortgage, a home equity line of credit. So if you owe $225,000 right now on your property worth $500,000, you can borrow up to 80% of the property value. And so in this example here, you would actually have a mortgage for $225,000 and you get a line of credit approved for $175,000. So combine the two amounts, add up to $400,000. Another very important key is from the tax perspective, your current personal mortgage is not tax deductible unless you are borrowing money to invest, okay? So how this product will work is over time, you're going to be working on paying down your mortgage from $225,000 down to lower amounts. And over time, what's going to happen is then that money that you've paid down on the mortgage increases your line of credit. So as you pay down your mortgage, the combined amount of your mortgage and your line of credit will equate to $400,000. So if you've paid down your mortgage from $225,000 down to $200,000, your line of credit will go from $175,000 to $200,000. You pay down your mortgage down to $100,000, now you have $300,000 available in your line of credit. And then what you do is you borrow that money that you've borrowed against the line of credit, and you use that to invest. And when you borrow money to invest with the intention of earning income, the interest payments are tax deductible. So the cool thing is you can actually work on borrowing money against your residence, use it to invest, buy properties that will cash flow, take that cash flow, pay down your personal non-tax deductible mortgage, opening up more room on your line of credit to then reborrow and then reinvest and continue to snowball that effect. So it's a very cool tool. There are a lot of complex things that I could spend an entire presentation on. In fact, earlier this year, I did go into an entire presentation about what's called the Smith Maneuver, which is a great book. A fellow named Robinson Smith, who is the son of the original author, did an awesome remake of this book to go into some more advanced tactics. And by the way, I do have a number of copies at my office. If anybody is interested in a copy, you can email us or visit our website and send us a note. I'm happy to pop a copy of this book in the mail, but it has great information inside of it about how you can minimize taxes and borrow money to invest and effectively increase your net worth over time. So a HELOC or home equity line of credit is eventually where you want to be, and that's where you want to get to. So some key points, and as I go through different stages of building your real estate portfolio, there are a couple of key points here. And so at each stage, I'm going to just pause for a second and go through what I think are important things to look at. And first and foremost is don't overextend on the residence. And one of the things we're going to get into in a little bit here is understanding how lenders factor in rental income when qualifying you. If you max out your borrowing power to purchase your residence, you're not going to leave enough room for you to be able to debt service any rental properties. And this is where sometimes it's a bit of a challenge because your personal lifestyle requirements and your investing requirements often will clash. It's very uncommon actually for them both to work. From an investment perspective, it's best for you to save all of your money, never go out, never have any fun, and just pile drive all of your money into savings and investments and grow your investment portfolio. But at the end of the day, everybody has to live, and it's important to understand that there is a bit of a fine balance. But just remember, don't overextend on your residence because it will negatively impact your ability to qualify for rentals later on down the road. A very simple one that we always recommend our clients do is get the longest amortization available to you. If you put less than 20% down, the longest amortization you can get is 25 years. If you're putting more than 20% down, then you can get up to a 30-year amortization. So there is a lot of flexibility here with amortizations, especially if you're putting more than 20% down. And we always recommend get the longest amortization you can. Now, especially in a residence, there's no tax benefit to keeping a very large amount outstanding on your personal residence. And so there's an incentive for you to pay off and pay down your mortgage. And especially if you have a home equity line of credit, you can pay down your mortgage, which gives you access to that same amount of money that you've paid down on it available to you in your line of credit, which is a great strategy. Keep in mind, however, if you increase your ongoing payments on a monthly basis from $2,000 to $3,000 a month, we now need to service that $3,000 a month payment instead of only needing to service $2,000 a month. If you want to pay down your mortgage, use the lump sum prepayment privileges. Most banks allow you to prepay between 10 to 20% of your original principal balance per year with no penalties. And so if you just take that $1,000 a month, put it into a savings account and make a lump sum on the mortgage, you're going to pay down the mortgage at effectively the same rate without negatively impacting your borrowing power, which is very key, especially as you're going to see as you build your real estate portfolio, the income requirements will become more and more strained. Very important key here, minimize or eliminate debt at this stage if you can. So before you're purchasing your primary residence, try to keep a minimal debt load. And this includes car loans, especially car loans, student loans, credit cards, lines of credit, et cetera. If you are refinancing as your first step in getting ready to invest in real estate, then a lot of the time we recommend that you actually consolidate all of your debt into your mortgage. You'll get a better interest rate on that money, and you'll have a lower payment to service that. Just to put things in perspective, every 100 grand you borrow right now is about $400 per month on the payment on a 30-year amortization. You might have a car loan where you owe $25,000 or $20,000, and the payments might be higher than $400 a month. And so sometimes we can roll a bunch of debt into the mortgage. We can actually lower the overall borrowing costs and lower debt servicing by doing that. Another thing I want to bring up now is because later on in the process, and again, this is talking about creating your blueprint, consider buying something that would be a good rental property in the future. And so you want to consider that if you bought this property now for yourself, if you just kept everything that you bought, that's a very easy strategy to build a real estate portfolio. So if you bought a residence with 5% down and then kept it and then bought another property for yourself later and just keep a trail of properties behind you, never sell anything, that's one of the simplest ways you could possibly buy real estate and build a portfolio. And so if you have that in mind, when you're buying a personal residence, you just think, would this be a good rental property for myself in the future? And if the answer is yes, then they may help you with making your decision on whether to buy that property or another one. For instance, some stratas do not allow rentals. And so if you buy into that building and then you want to upgrade and buy something else, you're not going to be able to keep that property and rent it out, which means that it's not as good of an investment for you as something else that could be rented out in the future. Because every time you buy and sell in provinces like British Columbia, Ontario, there are property transfer taxes that have to be paid. And when you sell, you have to pay realtor fees. So there's a lot of transaction costs to buying and selling all the time. If you can save yourself those transaction costs just by keeping everything that you buy, it's a great way of building a real estate portfolio. Another thing to consider is for those of you that are buying in not Vancouver or Toronto and trying to buy your first home, if you're buying in smaller communities especially, consider homes with basement suites. A home that has a basement suite in it that generates $1,000 a month in rent is the equivalent of covering $250,000 worth of your mortgage. And that's because going back to that $400 a month per 100 grand calculation on what your mortgage payments are, $100 or $1,000 a month would cover off about $250,000 of your mortgage payment. So if you're looking at two homes side by side and one is $700,000 and one is $800,000, but the $800,000 property has $1,000 a month basement suite in it and the $700,000 one does not, your net cash flow at the end of the day per month will be better with the property that is a bit more expensive but has the basement suite in it. Now, just because the rental suite generates $1,000 a month doesn't mean that the lender is going to use $1,000 a month. In fact, they'll usually use between 50 to 80% of that rental income. So it doesn't mean you qualify for $250,000 more, but if you can fit it into your budget and your qualifications, it's generally advisable, if you can, to consider buying a house that has a basement suite in it, as it will allow you to qualify for more debt in the future and it's better on your personal budget. So step number 3. Let's look at purchasing properties number 2 and 3. So we own our residence. That's all set up now. Either you bought it with 5% down, or now you've restructured it and now you have a home equity line of credit. Now what do you do, and how do you qualify for purchasing rental properties? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to qualify for rental properties, because it's very important for everybody to understand what the methods that lenders look at here are. And then it'll help you understand, how do I build my real estate portfolio, and just understanding the debt servicing that goes about it. Because we get this a lot. Clients say, well, I have $1 million in the bank, or I have $1 million in equity in my real estate. How come I can't qualify for a mortgage? It's because almost everything comes down to debt servicing. How much income do you have and how much debt do you have? And so it's very important for you to think about the debt servicing and revolve your game plan around that. So this is what most lenders use. It's called a 50% add to income. So if you had $1,000 a month in rent, they take 50% of it, so $500, and add it to your income. And then when they're looking at debt servicing, lenders usually want to use about 40 up to 44% of your income to use towards your borrowing power. And so really, out of that $1,000 a month, they take 50%, so $500, and then they want to use about 40% of that $500 a month because they've added it to your income, and they only are really using $200 a month in borrowing power. So that $200 a month would probably increase, your borrowing power by about $40,000 on a mortgage. Not a whole lot. There are some lenders that use what's called an offset, and this offset really varies depending on the lender. Some lenders use a 50% offset, some use a 70, 75, 80% offset, and there's even a few lenders that use a 90% or even 100% offset, which is very, very rare. But in general, the lenders that use an offset or up to an 80% offset. Now what happens is they take 80% of the rent and then use that rental income to offset all the expenses, and the leftover shortfall is a liability and added to your liabilities, or if it's a surplus, then they add that into your income. Now, the key difference here is that because they're taking that $800 and then using that to write off all of the expenses first, before they add or add it to income or to a liability, they're actually using $800 of that $1,000, not $200. So an 80% offset is actually using 4 times the income than a 50% add to income. So it's a really substantial difference that you need to consider. In general, for offsets, it's usually either credit unions or sometimes non-bank lenders that are using offsets. And so we do find that often major banks are a little bit tighter on their qualifications, but not always. Next up, and which is a bit more complicated, is what's called the DCR. It stands for debt coverage ratio. And what this is that the lenders want to see that inside of your portfolio, so all of your rental properties that you own, that your income is 1.1 to 1.2 times all of the expenses. And they also want to make sure that not just the portfolio, but the property that they're financing also has to meet this requirement. And ideally, they want to make sure that all the income is used. They're using all of the income, but you have to have a surplus in the portfolio. And so what ends up happening is, in general, lenders start to consider using a DCR when you have about 3 rental properties, give or take. And not every lender will use it. In fact, a DCR is something that that actually is the way that commercial lending is underwritten and financed. And so as you grow a real estate portfolio, some lenders say, well, you're kind of a hybrid of a residential and a commercial client because you're now operating this real estate business. So they do want to see that you have a positive cash flow within that business and within that framework. So debt coverage ratio is a common way that lenders look at it. One issue is that in Canada right now, you have to qualify on a stress test, and that stress test is a rate of 5.25%, whereas the current interest rates are less than half of that. And the problem is that when you're trying to use the DCR and trying to get, let's say, 80% leverage using the lender's standard requirements for all of their ratios, and in addition to that, also looking at using the stress test mortgage rate, not the actual interest rate, it is very difficult when lenders use this DCR for you to still be able to get 80% leverage. Most lenders start to narrow it down and drop the amount of leverage you can obtain. And on average, it's 60, 65%. But we've had deals where the maximum loan amount we can get on a property is only 30 or 35% under a DCR program. So it is not easy to qualify underneath these types of programs, and it's important to note that. So knowing that and understanding how lenders are qualifying you, let's look at buying that second property now. And you actually have 2 different paths to take. So you can either purchase a residence with, again, 5% down. Okay, so in these examples, by the way, every property that we're accumulating is a property that would be worth 500 grand, and either is going to be rented or could be rented for $2,500 a month. Now, if you're going to buy this as a residence, it has to make sense. And in general, you have to be slowly stepping up. And so it probably wouldn't make a lot of sense for you to buy a residence for yourself with 5% down for $500,000. And then a year later, buy another residence for yourself across the street for $500,000. The mortgage insurer probably won't believe your story. However, if you're slowly stepping up when you first bought a condo, and then you bought a townhouse, and then you bought a house, you can still get mortgage insurance. You can still put less than 20% down as long as you're purchasing a residence or a second home. In this case, you do need a higher income. So if you recall, to buy that first property, that first residence, we need about $105,000 in income. Now, in order to pull this one off, we're going to need probably more like 135 to 155,000, because remember that first property that we purchased was financed on a 25-year amortization, and you borrowed almost 100% of the asset value, and you're doing the same thing here all over again. And so you have to have enough income to service that shortfall on the rental property, because the lenders are going to use $2,500 a month in rent, and the one that you already purchased with 5% down. But according to the lender, that's not enough income to cover off all of the expenses. There's a small shortfall included in there that has to be accounted for. So you have to have some extra income to cover off that shortfall. The next option here is to buy this as a rental property. And in general, if you already own your own residence, you have a lot of equity in it, and you have a big HELOC with $500,000 available to you, then most of our clients are then purchasing these as rental properties with 20% down. If you're stabilized in your home and you're good. Generally speaking, the strategy of buying a residence with 5% down, turning it into a rental, then buying a next residence with 5% down and turning that into a rental later on and repeating it is generally only a strategy that we find young professionals with high incomes are doing. So if you have a low amount of liquidity because you haven't had enough time to save up and build your net worth, purchasing a residence and then converting it to a rental and purchasing another residence is just a way of getting into the market a bit faster than sitting and waiting around until you have 20% saved up. So if we look at just buying a rental property now, after we already own the residence, if you put 20% down, you would need about $120,000 income to maybe up to $165,000 income, assuming that you bought your first property with only 5% down. And we can get a 30-year amortization on the rental property instead of only being able to get a 25-year amortization on this purchase. Now we also want to look at what happens when you buy the third property. Now this is where it gets a little bit trickier because a residence, you're probably going to start raising some eyebrows at the mortgage insurers. And in fact, in many cases, they will only allow you to do 2 residences with 5% down. But in some cases, you might be able to sneak out the third. And in that case, you need about $150,000 to $200,000 in income in order to do this. And it would really have to make a lot of sense, especially if you've been stepping up slowly over time and you bought a condo and then a townhouse and then a house. If you're buying 3 properties all worth the same amount, all in the same city, it's going to be really tough for you to sell that. Now, if your third property is a rental, we're probably inching up the income a little bit, the income requirements, and now we're looking at about $130,000 to $180,000 in household income required for that third rental property. So slowly over time, even though a property worth $500,000 with $2,500 a month in rent is a pretty good cash flowing property, according to the lenders, it's still a slight negative. And so as you build the real estate portfolio, it does get tighter and tighter. The reason we have a range here is that lenders that use more rental income will require you to have less income in order to qualify. And the lenders that use very little rental income will require you to have more income in order to qualify. So that's why we have a range of 130 to 180 there. So here's a couple of key points that I think are important to understand when you're at this stage of the game. Properties number 2 and 3, which lenders to use. And this is really important because a lot of lenders actually have a cap or limit on the number of properties that you can own with them and or in total. And that cap is generally 5. And so it's important for you to figure out, well, where do you want to take this? Do you want to buy 10 rental properties in the next couple of years? In that case, a more aggressive approach, we may say, hey, it may be a bit more expensive or more difficult, but maybe we should try to preserve some of those lenders that are really good for when things get tough. Let's preserve those lenders for later. Let's use lenders now for your first couple of rentals because we don't need that extra debt servicing room or flexibility. We can grow that portfolio in a different way, and we can use non-bank lenders, for instance, to grow it because we don't need to use all of that income. So sometimes a different strategy on which lenders to use is relevant and important. And in addition to that, this is kind of tied into it. Most investors, when they first approach and come to us, usually the first rental property that they're purchasing, in general, they're usually quite rate sensitive, and they say, okay, I really want the best rate. Okay, no problem. But in order to get the best rate, maybe you need to put 25% or 30% down or 35% down or whatever. So the problem is that leverage is generally more important than rate. Rate is important, but for 0.1% or 0.2% of the mortgage, if you can get more leverage with a different lender, it's better for you to get 80% leverage and then and suck it up and get a slightly higher interest rate to do that, because that extra amount of leverage that you have access to will allow you to build a portfolio more quickly. And the reality is, if you have access to more capital, you will be able to make lots more money than the amount that it's costing you to pay an extra 0.1 or 0.2% on that mortgage. Really important key here, and this is you're starting to get a little bit more difficult, but you haven't even hit the difficult part yet. You need to make sure that in the beginning you're buying strong cash flow properties. If you start to buy a lot of properties that cash flow negative according to you, then they're very negative according to the lender. If you have a high income, maybe you won't hit that wall quite as soon as somebody else, but you will eventually hit that wall, and when you hit it, you'll hit it hard. And so it's important that you start off by buying really strong cash flowing properties. And another key I want to mention is don't fall into the analysis paralysis trap. A lot of our clients are thinking, oh, I'm gonna get into real estate. I'm gonna buy a rental property, and you start to dive into it, and you're trying to figure out, okay, what what properties am I going to purchase? Where am I going to buy them? What am I going to buy? Which property is the best for me to purchase? And always looking for that perfect deal. And a year goes by, 2 years goes by, and the market has gone up by 20% in that 2-year span, and you haven't purchased anything. Keep in mind that even if you just bought a rental property that was good, you're still going to make a lot more money than if you didn't do anything at all. And in fact, even if you bought a property where the tenant just covered your mortgage payments for you, and even if there's zero appreciation, so the property value never even went up, you're still going to make anywhere between a 7 to 10% return on your investment just by having the tenant pay down your mortgage for you. So what that means is that if we take a $500,000 purchase as an example, you're going to be paying down about $7,000 to $10,000 per year in the principal on that mortgage. On a $500,000 property for that, in that example, if you put $100,000 down and you're making $7,000 to $10,000 in mortgage pay down per year, you're making a 7 to 10% return on your money just from having the tenant pay down your mortgage for you. So again, keep in mind, don't fall into the analysis paralysis trap. It's better to buy something. It doesn't have to be the perfect deal, and in fact, most deals aren't perfect. Step number 4. Let's get into purchasing properties number 4 and 5. All right. So you're probably feeling pretty good. You're relaxed. You think, this real estate stuff is really easy. Just wait until you've been declined. And I want to talk a little bit about what your bank probably isn't telling you, because the problem is things always seem to be rosy until you hit the wall, and you're all of a sudden in a situation where you're like, man, I didn't realize that I was walking into a trap. I didn't even know that these policies or these guidelines were going to come up, and then I was going to get smacked right into the wall and not be able to do anything. So it's important to understand a couple of key metrics. Let's talk about the same thing that we've been going through already. First of all, a residence with 5% down, that's not happening anymore. You're going to find that the insurers are not going to be able to allow you to buy, especially a 4th and a 5th property as an owner-occupied property. And have that insured. In general, usually it's 2 insured mortgages max, maybe 3. But numbers 4 and 5, those won't be happening. So you're looking at buying these as rental properties. And in general, you're probably going to need, for properties 4 and 5, about $150,000 to $220,000 in income is going to be required in order to be able to do this. And so again, the income requirements are slowly inching up as you continue to build the portfolio. Couple of key points, and these are the things that that your bank may not be telling you, but lender guidelines vary and stack with more properties. And what I mean by that is that if you have a lender that uses a small percentage of the rental income, every property would be a large negative impact on you. And if you have 4 or 5 properties, it's going to stack against you. So let's say, for instance, that according to the lender, a rental property might be a $500 per month liability. If you have 4 rental properties now, you're going to take that number and multiply it out by the number of properties you have. So if you have 5 rental properties times $500 a month, now you have to carry a $2,500 a month liability, and it's stacking, and it's becoming more and more difficult as you build the real estate portfolio. Lender guidelines are very different. In fact, they're so different that inside of our office, I created a wicked spreadsheet that allows us to actually underwrite for all of the lenders inside the broker channel, outside the broker channel, but it allows us to assess which lender can get this deal done. And it's because every lender has a different guideline. And so what we do is we actually put it into one sheet, and it actually underwrites and lets us know what the debt service ratio is, the DCR is, et cetera, with all of the lenders. And so we can see at a glance which lenders might be able to do it, because otherwise we have to go into the system, run the numbers. Does it work? Yes or no? Okay, no. Go to the next lender, run the numbers again, and it's very inefficient. So keep in mind, different lenders have different guidelines. If your bank tells you no, it doesn't mean the answer is no. It just means that they can't make it work. And the number of deals that we get where a bank said no, and we realized, oh, well, actually, all we needed to do was this. We just need to restructure it or take it to a different lender. Just keep that in mind, that lender guidelines do vary, especially as your portfolio grows. That variance on a number of different outputs will start to stack and become a very big difference. Properties number 4 and 5, the DCR does become more relevant in some cases. So some lenders will now say, well, now that you have this many properties, we do have to use the debt coverage ratio. And you might find all of a sudden that the bank that you've been working with that was giving you 80% financing might come back to you and say, well, on this property, now that you have this many properties, we can only give you 60% financing. And that might come into left field to you. So again, we find that that the banks aren't the greatest at explaining their policies and what you're going to walk into later on. It's important for you to understand that as an investor and have a lot of options so that you can always just be fluid and moving around and flowing to the lender that currently has the best policies. Because not only does every lender have different policies, but they're all changing all the time too. And I find that sometimes I'll send 20% of my overall book of business to one bank for a year or two, and all of a sudden they change policies, and now I'm only sending 5% of my business. Or another lender changes, and I might go from sending 5% of my business to 30% of my business for a year. So things change, and these policies will be very fluid. Another important thing that does not come up very often, because this is not a black and white a rule with many lenders. In fact, it's gray with most. A couple of banks, it is very black and white where you have to meet certain requirements. But liquid assets will be put under the magnifying glass. And so as you build your real estate portfolio, it is very important that you also grow your liquid investments as well. Because if you have a large portfolio, then the chance of a number of negative things happening at the same time is much higher. So you have to be able to accommodate these types of situations. And so a general rule of thumb, $30,000 to maybe as high as $50,000 in liquid assets per rental property is advised and recommended. Many lenders do not require that much, but we do generally recommend that, as much as I believe in real estate, you should also be diversified, and you should have some assets and something else. And there is something to be said, especially if you're also self-employed, for having liquidity. And if you look at the number of businesses that go bankrupt, it's typically not because of their profitability, it's because of their liquidity. So just keep that in mind. Last item I want to talk about here is that most lenders have the 5 max rule. So the 5 max rule means that most lenders will not finance you for more than 5 properties. If you go to your own bank and buy 5 properties, you're probably done with them, no matter how strong you are. And some lenders have a cap of 5 properties in total. So even if you only have 1 mortgage with them or 0 mortgages with them, you may not be able to get any more financing through a bank that has a 5 cap. And so again, understanding which lenders have those caps and which ones don't, that's where we come in and we can add a lot of value to helping you create that game plan. So let's talk about a summary. As I've mentioned earlier, it's all about debt servicing. So it's really important you focus on cash flowing property. It's great to buy potential future appreciation plays and be a developer, but the reality is you should focus on cash flow real estate first, build up your net worth that way, and then start to switch into some of the bigger things that are frankly higher risk. Capital appreciation plays are higher risk. Cash flow is much better to assess and a much higher likelihood of being consistent. Take 30-year amortizations on all of your debt. If you're purchasing a residence with less than 20% down, of course, that's not an option. So take the longest amortization you can. But the plan is clear here. Make sure you're amortizing your debt over the longest period possible. And another thing is eliminating all other high interest debt. A car loan for $25,000 with a $550 a month payment is the same as borrowing $100,000 in a mortgage. So that's the qualifying payment on a car loan with $550 per month owing on it is the same as borrowing $100,000 in a mortgage. So a lot of the time it's important, and we have clients all the time that have a truck with $1,000 a month payment, and that's lowering your borrowing power by nearly $200,000. So it's really important to make sure that you take that into consideration. In general, if you're looking at buying a property, a primary residence for yourself, and buying a vehicle, do the house first, because I'm telling you right now, the policies are much easier to get a vehicle later on than it is to purchase a property and getting a mortgage. As an example, I maxed out my borrowing power when I was 19 and I bought my first property. I bought it for $300,000 with 0 down on a 40-year amortization, and I maxed everything out. I was 1 year into the business, and right after that, I went out and got a car loan. I got a Nissan Sentra SER Spec V, really fun car to drive. and I got a $450 a month payment on a car right after I just maxed myself out on qualifying for for my own townhouse, my own personal residence. So not to say that things haven't changed since then, but for the most part, car financing is much easier to obtain. And for those of you that have gone through getting a car loan, the amount of documentation and frankly the government oversight is much lower in that space than it is in mortgages. If you don't already have a HELOC, getting a HELOC should be step number one, or step number two if you consider step number one being the planning part of things. But if you can qualify to get a HELOC, you should be getting a HELOC. And it's important to follow the game plan. Saying that I love is if you plan to fail, or if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So just keep that in mind, that it's important to think about where you want to take this and where you want to end up. And also to surround yourself with experts who understand how to invest in real estate. There are realtors that specialize in working with investors. There are accountants, there are lawyers, mortgage brokers, obviously. There's a lot of professionals that we surround ourselves with. And if you need a referral for anybody, just reach out to us. We're happy to point you in a direction, because I've been working with real estate investors for, I think, since 2008. So for 13 years now. This has been our niche here at Green Mortgage. We have contacts for pretty much anything that you need, especially if it's investor related. So feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to help. And remember, game plans vary person to person. A game plan for 5 properties, which we'll talk about at a future webinar, is very different. And game plans for individuals can vary person to person. For instance, somebody who's self-employed may find it's harder for them to qualify for rental properties, but maybe easier for them to buy residences. And so that buying residences and leaving a trail behind them could be a good strategy for that. So we do tell people, you need to tailor make things and make sure that you have a game plan that's tailor made to you. This game is very complicated. I've hired and trained a number of staff in my career, and it is very complicated. It takes a long time to learn all the ins and outs of how to finance a real estate portfolio. It's much easier if you work with a professional that actually knows what they're doing, and we can make it easy as getting a mortgage can be. And frankly, guys, I'll tell you a secret: getting a mortgage sucks, but it's a means to an end. It's a means to helping you build wealth using real estate. So who's in? Who wants to invest in real estate? Who wants to make some money? Why don't more people invest in real estate? There's a lot of different reasons for that. And one of the reasons that people don't invest in real estate is the deal analysis part. I did want to give people, before we wrap up for the evening, a couple of little key tips on doing an analysis. I always use shortcuts. So first shortcut I look at is, what is the rent to price ratio on a property? Every 100 grand in value, I want about $400 a month or more in cash flow if possible. Some properties are going to generate less cash flow, and that's just the reality of it. Properties in major urban centers, especially detached homes, tougher to cash flow. But I am aiming for a rent to price ratio of 0.4. So if I find a property for $500,000, I want $2,000 a month in rent or more. If it's about $2,000 a month in rent, I know it should be about cash flow neutral. Use tools. I have a cash flow analysis spreadsheet that's available on our website. You can go to our website at www.greenmortgageteam.ca. You can download it right from there. Another tool that I use a lot is rentometer.com. You can go to that website. You can punch in the address, the number of bedrooms, and a few other data points. And it'll actually pull up a bunch of listings in that market and tell you whether your rents are in the medians or the average, and what different listings in the area are going for. Of course, Craigslist is a little bit more specific, but a little bit more time consuming, I find. I generally like to go with macro data and just use Rentometer and look at maybe the 50th percentile or 70th percentile based on how I feel the unit might compare versus the marketplace. For instance, if I'm purchasing a brand new unit, I'll probably say, well, my unit's probably gonna be nicer and in the 75th percentile, meaning that it's in the top quarter of all units in that market. I'll use the 75th percentile type of rents in that area. Craigslist is a little bit more specific, and I find it can be a little bit all over the map, but sometimes they can give you a better idea, especially if your property is very unique. You might be able to find other comparables on Craigslist. And another thing is really important is to quickly filter. So you want to use specific metrics to compare the return on investment, because you make money in generally three ways investing in real estate. It's from the cash flow, paying down the mortgage, and from the appreciation. And make sure you quickly gain an understanding of the market that you're trying to purchase in. So understanding, what type of properties seem to cash flow in certain areas. It just speeds up the process, and you're ideally trying to create a bit of a filter system where you can very quickly analyze deals without spending too much time on it. And so this is a quick snapshot of what our Excel spreadsheet looks like. You punch in the purchase price, the rental income, and the expenses, and it'll tell you what your cash flow is, your cash on cash return, your return on investment in total and annually, et cetera. Now, again, I talked earlier about analysis paralysis. None of this matters if you don't turn this knowledge into action. It's important for you to go out there and start to look at places, start writing offers. Nothing warms the soul better than writing an offer and going through that period. And you learn a lot. Even if you don't buy that property, keep in mind, writing the offer is not what you need to be worried about. It's removing the subjects on that offer. So if you write an offer with subjects and you go through due diligence and something does not pan out, as long as you have good subjects, you can back out of the deal. Obviously, get good advice on that from a realtor to make sure that you have the right subjects in your contract. But it is not about writing the offer that should scare you. It's going firm on a contract that should scare you. Just another thing that I wanted to mention too, that for those of you that want to take this a bit more seriously, I also have another sister company called Green Wealth, and that's for people that want to treat this more like a business. And so we offer a lot of a little bit more holistic planning and a little bit more in-depth planning. We tie in, what the realtor's trying to do, the lawyer's trying to do, what the accountant's trying to recommend. We get on a call with you and your accountant to try and sort things out and make sure that we have the right game plan for you and deep dive into that. So those of you that want to learn more about that, feel free to reach out to us as well. And we have a lot of tools to help you create that success, creating a game plan, execution and accountability. We help with property analysis, education, and a number of tools. So something to look into if you want to take that a step further. Feel free to book a consultation with us today. As I talked about earlier, everybody's game plan is different, and it really helps to have somebody with an outside look at it. And a lot of the time, we are going to close some doors on you, but it will help you, because if we can close a few doors and say, look, you can't buy the $10 million property, but you can buy something for $1 million, at least then okay, I know exactly what I can do. You can create laser focus and start getting out there and get writing offers. If you want to learn more, please visit our website. We have upcoming webinars. You can download a number of our spreadsheets and other tools on our website. There's FAQs, et cetera, full of great content. And by the way, for anybody who would like a copy of our book, I wrote a book and it became a best-selling book a couple of years ago. It's called Rockstar Real Estate Investing. It's great for people that are trying to learn just the fundamentals of how to invest in real estate. So the first 10 people that email us at info@greenmortgageteam.ca, that's info@greenmortgageteam.ca, we'll pop a copy of our book in the mail and send it over to you. So that's all I have for today, guys. I will now answer some questions and get back to you guys. I think there's some items in the Q&A here I'll start to address. Okay, let's get into it. So somebody asked if we're emailing a recording of the session later on. Yes, we are recording this, and we'll be emailing it out to everybody later on. And we have a question. So if I don't own my own home, should I think about getting into real estate? Or if I don't own my own home, I shouldn't think about getting into real estate. No, if you don't own your own home, then it makes sense for you to consider buying your own personal residence. And that's generally step number one. Not always, but it's generally step number one is looking at owning where you live. That's generally going to be the asset that makes you the most money. Now, again, there are certain circumstances where if you have a killer deal on rent and you can live there forever, or if you're living at home with parents and your parents, your parents don't mind you living there and you don't mind living with parents, which is uncommon nowadays, but it happens. Then maybe you decide to live at home and buy rental properties. But in most cases, own the place that you're going to live in is usually the best move. Rob has a good question. How will a line of credit affect my debt service ratio? So some lenders do include the line of credit limit in your debt service calculations, and some lenders only include the balance of your line of credit in your debt servicing calculations. So again, this is where we get down to customizing the game plan. If we intend on using certain lenders to build your real estate portfolio, we may not be wise to get the biggest possible home equity line of credit registered against your residence, because that might negatively impact your ability to build your real estate portfolio moving forward. So it's important to factor in how your line of credit limit will affect your debt service ratio, because with some lenders it will affect it and some lenders it will not. And of course, we know which ones it will and which ones it won't. Julia has a question. Would you say it's difficult to make any profit on rental income in cities like Vancouver where real estate is expensive? And if so, where would you recommend investing? So it's important, Juliet, to understand there's a difference between cash flow and profit, right? Because the profit in investing in real estate is cash flow, mortgage pay down, and appreciation. The cash flow is obviously a lot harder to achieve in Vancouver. That rent to price ratio is much lower. However, on the flip side, if you look at the appreciation factor, major urban centers tend to have better appreciation over long periods of time than smaller non-urban markets. So if you're looking at total profit, you might find that if you're prepared and willing to purchase properties that have less cash flow, if you have a very high personal income or something along those lines, you might find that your overall return on investment buying properties will have a higher appreciation rate, might be better. And that's where I actually use my spreadsheet a lot to look at, well, if I think this property will have more appreciation, I'll put in a slightly higher appreciation rate. And does it offset that cash flow? Do I have an overall higher return on investment or not? So I like to play around with numbers, and I'm very data driven when I make decisions. Markets where I would recommend considering, if you're looking for stronger cash flow, markets like Edmonton and Calgary can have much stronger cash flow. I'm not so sold on the appreciation rates of those markets, but they do have better cash flow. I have a lot of clients buying in New Brunswick right now. The rents as a function of the purchase prices are very good, and so cash flow can be very solid in areas like New Brunswick. Some parts of Vancouver Island can be good. I've seen some good deals in, let's say, Souk or Duncan on the island, Nanaimo sometimes, or the interior can occasionally have good deals. But in the Lower Mainland in Vancouver here, Chilliwack used to be a pretty good spot to pick up good cash flowing properties, and Mission would be the other area. There are still some opportunities there, but it's becoming harder and harder to find. And in general, if you're looking at those two markets, Chilliwack, you definitely have to have a house with a basement suite or maybe 2 suites in the basement. And in Mission, you almost definitely have to have 3 units in total in order for it to cash flow reasonably. Brandon has a question. If I'm buying properties, should I be buying personally or in a company? What is the best way to do this? As I want to buy 5 to 10 properties eventually. Currently, I have 1 residence and 3 rentals in my personal name. So yeah, this is a question that comes up a lot, Brandon. And if you ask an accountant, here's what they're going to tell you. It depends. And I hate that answer. But it is to a certain extent true. So one of the things that we have to look at here is how do how do you structure a portfolio knowing that you want to get to 5 or 10? Does it make sense to buy in a company name or not? Here's the general synopsis of it. There's a couple reasons that it would make sense or could make sense to buy in a company name. The number one reason, if you own a company, an incorporated business, like an operating company, and that company is generating a lot of surplus income, it almost always makes sense to set up an incorporated business and set up a holding company. The reason for that is that your operating company can then lend money to your holding company, which then purchases the assets. And you're effectively investing pre-tax dollars, because the operating company will only pay about 11% tax. But if you took that income home, you're going to pay the 11% corporate tax rate, and then you're going to pay about 40% personal tax rate, and then invest whatever you have left over. And if you have it in the holding company or an operating company and you lend it to the holding company, you'll pay the 11% tax, and then you'll still have, if you have 100 grand, you'll still have 89 grand left over to then invest using the holding company. Keep in mind, a holding company is taxed at 50% tax. So the holding company is taxed at a higher tax rate than many individuals are taxed at. And so if you're not planning on building up to scale, it doesn't always make sense for you to buy or set up a holding company. So in general, number one, if you own an operating company, it often makes sense. Number two, if you're going to plan and scale this to a very large scale, so 5 to 10 properties or even more than that, then it may make sense to do this in a company structure, because for estate planning, it can be easier for you to actually sell shares in that company and start to divest those shares into to children's names, for instance. So that can make more sense. And in addition to that, there are ways that you can minimize the taxes in that corporate structure. For instance, if you own a large number of properties, you may be able to set up a separate operating company that is a property management and consulting company that then invoices your holding company, and you're shifting that positive income in the holdco into an operating co, which is a lower tax rate. So it's a very long explanation, Brandon, but it is a challenge to answer that. Every situation is different. Talk to 3 different accountants, you'll probably get 3 different answers. And the reality is it is difficult to have, one solid answer that absolutely makes sense. Alejandra has a question. How common is the vendor take-back program in Vancouver for buying your first home? I just want to clarify what you mean by that, Alejandra. So there's a vendor take-back, which a vendor take-back is when you purchase a property from a seller, a vendor, and the vendor takes back a mortgage. And so I could go to a seller and say, hey, I only have 10% down, but I want to buy your property. I also can't qualify for a mortgage for whatever reason. Would you carry a mortgage for me? And in some cases, a seller would say, yes, I'll carry a mortgage for you. In fact, they can defer the capital gains on their sale for up to 5 years based on carrying a mortgage for you. So there can be some benefits for the seller. We used to see this a lot where we'd go to a bank and get 80% financing, and then we get 10% as a vendor take back and then 10% down payment from you. So you're minimizing your down payment. The problem now is that that lenders are typically not allowing you to be borrowing any money for the down payment on rental properties. And so that's not really an option. If your question, Alejandra, is revolving around the government incentive or the government program, the home partnership program where the government will lend you some of your down payment, I honestly don't actually know if we've done even one in our office, and we fund 300 to 400 transactions a year. So it's very uncommon. The way to look at it is that the government is effectively lending you some money and saying, hey, now you don't have to pay interest, which currently the interest rates are 2% or less. So now you don't have to pay 2% interest on that money, but now they get a share of your real estate values. And if the appreciation rate is higher than the interest cost you're saving, then it actually does not make sense from a financial perspective for you to take it. So we might see more people shift and do this. If the interest rates start to go up and the expected appreciation moving forward goes down, then we might see more people take it, because now you're saving maybe 4% in interest and you're foregoing maybe 2% of expected appreciation. So I hope that answers your question, and that may have been long-winded, but hopefully it helps. Alden has a question. Are pre-sales good investment opportunities? They can be. One issue I do have with pre-sales is that people are making a buying decision today on a property that isn't complete for a couple of years. And the number of times I see investors all of a sudden get to this point in a couple of years where like, oh crap, I have to close on this property. I've completely forgot, and I've bought a bunch of rental properties in the meantime, and now I don't qualify for this purchase. Or you bought it, and many investors do this. They buy with the intention of assigning the contract and making a quick buck doing that, and then they realize that the market tanks, and now they can't get rid of the property. That can put people in precarious positions. It's important that if you're going to do a pre-sale, they can be good opportunities, but make sure you're not looking at tomorrow's prices. Buy it based off of it being a deal at today's prices, because you don't know what's going to happen with tomorrow's prices. And keep in mind, a lot of the time people say, well, just buy the pre-sale because by the time it closes, it'll be worth more money. Well, yeah, but if you bought a property that's currently on the market today, if the market went up, then it would be the same situation, right? So I don't really see that logic. It's important that you just have to make sure that you're prepared and willing to close on it if you have to. So they can be good investments, but they often are a tough situation when buyers don't anticipate or bank on actually closing. So somebody asked me to put my contact information on the screen. Yeah, absolutely. So info@greenmortgageteam.ca and 604-229-5515 is our phone number. So anybody that wants to reach out can do that there. What's the top location? Oh, Paulo, I like this. What's the top location that your clients are buying rental properties in? Vancouver area is cash flow negative. What's the top area? I would say for a while there, it was Chilliwack. A lot of our clients were buying in Chilliwack because there's a good mix of it's close enough to the city where you could drive out to it if you were, especially for Vancouver-based clients. People could still drive out to it and touch it, feel it, talk to the tenants if they need to, and yet the cash flow is quite good. And I have seen that has tapered off a little bit because the values have gone up significantly. Other areas that I've seen, Langford on the island near Victoria. That's been an interesting market. I do like the idea of buying in Langford, especially properties that detached homes that have the ability to be able to be redeveloped. What other markets do I really like right now? The other thing that I'm seeing a lot of is Airbnbs. A lot of our clients are buying properties that they're going to Airbnb. In fact, myself and my fiance are buying an Airbnb in Victoria, and it's a 7-unit property that we're buying, and we're going to Airbnb it, and we're raising some joint venture capital. So if anybody wants more information about that too, feel free to email. But we're raising some capital for that project as well, and the cash flow on Airbnbs, if done right, can be very, very lucrative. But it is a business. It's completely different than sticking a long-term tenant in the property. You have to have a business plan, and again, you're really running a hospitality business in that field. So I would say, to answer your question, Chilliwack, Langford, and then Airbnbs scattered amongst recreational properties. Those are probably the most common things that I'm seeing right now. Question here from Jessica. Sorry to reach out to you here. Enjoy the webinar. Not qualified for the bank. If I'm doing a fix and flip using private money as a stepping strategy, as you suggested, what interest rate do I expect borrowing $500,000? So on private money, whenever you're borrowing money from a private lender, which is very common when you're doing flips, in general, private lending will cost anywhere from, the low end, if you're borrowing only 50% of the value of the property, then 4.95% is out there with about 2% in fees in total. If you're borrowing up to 80% of the property value, you might be looking at 8 to 9% interest with 3 or even up to 4% in fees. So it really depends on the amount that you're borrowing. In general, the less you borrow means lower risk for the investor and the lender, which means a lower interest cost. And so for a fix and flip, how do you identify potential property from the market? Any filter tools? How do you know when property has a potential for profit or not? What expenses to consider? Do you have any analysis tool available? So yes, my cash flow analysis tool actually does have a tab for a flip analysis. It is very, very basic, and the intention is just to give you a high level understanding. If I'm looking at a flip, what I do is I look at the property, and then the first thing I do is I see if it's a condo in particular, I look at what other condos have sold recently in the building. And then I go look at those and I compare those versus my property that I have under contract or that I'm doing an analysis on. And I try to figure out, okay, how much would it cost me to upgrade my property to that one that sold for this much? So if I'm looking at a property that's listed for $500,000 and I see another one that sold for $600,000 and it was about the same square footage, then I want to understand, what do the pictures look like? What's the difference between the two properties here? And how much would it cost me to bring that property up to $600,000? That's it. You're trying to look for good, solid, comparable properties that you could sell. And if you're buying a detached house, for instance, the same applies. You want to do what's called a CMA, a comparative market analysis that a realtor could do for you, and also get an appraisal. And an appraiser can do a as is and an as if complete valuation for you to give you an idea of what the current value is and what it would be worth if you did all this work. So that's generally what I'm looking at. Keep in mind all the entry and exit costs. You have property transfer tax to close on it. You have realtor fees to sell it. You have carrying costs like property taxes, strata fees, mortgage payments, etc. while you're owning it. And if you're doing private money, you also have the fees and potentially on both buying it and also on the early breakage fees, depending on the structure of the mortgage. And usually we recommend open mortgages with privates. And the last question here was for flex and flip. Can you use more than one agent at the same time for finding potential property? And I would say in general, yes, if you're looking at different areas. I would just be upfront with the realtors and let them know that, hey, you are looking at a few other with a few other realtors, and that bring you good deals, and you're ready and willing to close. Just keep that in mind. You got to be, realtors are going to bring their good deals to the people that take action, write offers, and close on deals, right? If you're kicking tires and every deal that they send over to you, you hum and haw about, they're not going to waste any time with you. They're going to send it to the next buyer who's ready and willing to jump on it. Vignesh has a question. Do cash flow opportunities exist in Vancouver? Kind of. It is tough. I think condos may be a good opportunity. I think that the rental rates in condo market will start to increase in the next little while. Fully furnished rentals are good. One thing I've been noticing is I'm doing a 14-unit apartment building flip in North Vancouver, and currently a few of the units are being subleased and rented out through a company that does medium-term rentals, so 1 to 6 month rentals. They have clients with clients like C-SPAN and other large companies like that actually put their high-level employees and executives into these units. For instance, one of the units that we're actually selling in that building right now for about $700,000, the gross rents that company earns is about $4,500 a month. They take a 30% cut off the top, and the owner of the property gets about $3,000 a month on that, which is pretty good. And you look at that, you would be cash flow positive on that type of deal, but you have to buy in the right property. And in fact, because we were the ones that developed and set up the strata and everything, we actually set it up so the strata allows for short-term rentals in the building. But that is a concern, is that in downtown Vancouver, or just Vancouver in general, short-term rentals are not allowed. So you have to do medium-term, which is longer than 30 days. I find that those are usually the opportunities to cash flow best. Sometimes, though, you can also get into properties in, let's say, East Vancouver, and maybe it's a unit that has a bunch of units in it, so a fourplex, for instance. That's something that could be a good example. And Vignesh, I just saw your comment, so I'll send, if you send me an email, I'll send you over some more information on that and whatnot. Emmanuel, a couple of quick questions. So you've got a residence for $400,000 and a rental worth 160. If the rental property is paid off, but residence is still owing about 370, can you take a HELOC on the rental property to purchase another property? So yes, you can get up to 80% financing against any property that you own in your portfolio. So a lot of the time, the first step that we look at is, where are you going to access your capital? And you can get up to 80% financing on all of your real estate. And so as long as you qualify to do that, we often will look at, sometimes the client will just send us, hey, here's my portfolio. I've got 7 rental properties. What should I do? We'll often look at, well, which properties have the most room for us to access the most capital, and we usually target those ones and see if we can bring it up to 80% financing to do that. So yeah, if you have the rental property paid off, then you could definitely get a line of credit or a mortgage set up against it. One thing to keep in mind, the line of credit component can only be maximum 65% of the value of the property. If you want to get access to 80% in total, then 15% has to be a mortgage. The other 65% can be a line of credit, and those two numbers combined is 80% leverage. Cindy has a question. Any tips on purchasing properties outside of your own province? Yeah, it's an interesting one. Obviously, we found a lot of our business became more BC based because of COVID, because people couldn't travel or were more restricted to travel to go view properties outside of province. It's important to understand and just work with people that you trust, because we do have people that buy stuff outside of the province and they don't see it themselves, and all of a sudden they realize, oh man, I was sold a bill of goods. I was told that the area was really good, and now that I'm here, I can tell that this is not the nice area of town, and that's why the cash flow is much better, because I'm going to have ongoing tenant issues. So that can be a problem. Buying outside of your province. One of the challenges is property management is probably the #1 key when you're buying out of province, because you have to really rely on them to do their job properly, because it's really hard for you to just drop the property manager and say, okay, I'm just going to deal with this myself. You know, if you can drive 30 minutes to deal with your property yourself, you can drop the property manager, deal with it, and take some time to find a new property manager. A little bit harder if you're dealing with somebody that out of province. A little bit harder to micromanage them, so to speak. And then the other issue is just making sure that you still find an opportunity to view it and understand that market. Obviously, everybody wants to invest in their backyard because you understand the local market here. You know, people are more likely to know what areas of Langley are nice or not nice if you live in Vancouver. Whereas if you're buying in another province, then you may not know that. So those would be the two keys I would mention. Try as a question. I currently own 4. 3 are not cash flow positive or small negative rental properties. Closing on my 5th and 6th next year and 30% down. Will I be able to get access to reasonable financing? So a hard question to answer on that try. It really depends on your overall income. Let me just be clear on this. Just because you have 30% down does not mean that you're a slam dunk in any means. However, sometimes having more down payment can open up some doors for you. But most importantly, you have to have sufficient income depending on the lenders. Number 2, buying properties that produce positive cash flow so you could possibly use a DCR to be able to qualify would help. Although your other properties not cash flowing positive might negatively impact the overall DCR, so you might not be able to qualify under that type of program. And there are some net worth programs that could help too if your liquid net worth is very strong. Another question, I have a HELOC, but my current property increased its value. Is it worth it to ask for an appraisal and pay a lawyer to increase my HELOC to use in buying a second property? A lot of our clients have been doing that. One cool thing, and I did a presentation, a webinar on this, I think it was last month or the month before, but I talked about accessing your home equity in your home to invest. And there's a number of different things you can invest in when you do this. If you had $200,000 extra accessible to you and you borrowed money to invest and you could invest it at 8% and your cost of borrowing is probably prime plus a half, so 2.95, so let's call it 3%, you're creating a 5% spread on that money. 5% of $200,000 is 10 grand per year that you're making just by having access to capital. So if you're going to want to use the money to invest, having access to the capital is the number one thing, because there are opportunities left, right, and center. I get inundated with opportunities all day long. Just today, I got emailed a rent-to-own opportunity from a realtor who's trying to find an investor to purchase a rent-to-own. They have a tenant buyer that's going to pay higher than market rent to live in it. You know, there's lots of opportunities that come up, especially if you're connected. And I would highly recommend, if you have an opportunity to get access to more capital, then you should take that for sure. Domino has a question, is there maximum value subject to approved credit for the principal home that can be purchased to 5% down? So there is. So there's 2 things to consider. Down payment minimum is 5% down up to 500,000. And then it's 10% on the remainder up to $1 million. And if you're over $1 million, you cannot do it with less than 20% down. So the maximum is as $1 million to put less than 20% down. The scale works out where if you bought something for $999,000, your down payment would effectively be $75,000, because it would be $25,000 on the first 500 grand and then $50,000 on the second 500 grand, because you have to put 10% down on any amounts over $500,000. So hope that answers your question. Patrick has a question. If your HELOC is exhausted, what is the best way to get the 20% down payment when moving from property number 2 to property number 3? That's a good question. In general, if you're exhausted and you have no other assets anywhere else, and you don't have anything else that you can tap into, in those situations, Patrick, normally we just advise our client, if you have a HELOC on your residence right now and you have non-tax deductible debt and tax deductible debt, just work on paying down your non-tax deductible debt and just hammer that home as much as possible, which would then increase your line of credit availability, which then you'd have money available for making another purchase. Another option, Patrick, is if it's reasonable for you to do so, you could look at, well, instead of saving up 20% down to buy a rental, your game plan could instead be, hey, maybe I'll buy a residence and I'll do that with the minimum down payment of, if it's under $1 million, then 5% of the first 500 grand, 10% of the remainder. It's a much lower capital requirement for you. But again, if you're living in a $2 million home and you're trying to tell the insurer that you're going to move into an $800,000 home, they're probably not going to buy that. So that could be a challenge. In Vancouver, do you recommend investing in condos? Yeah, actually, I do like condos. I like condos for a few reasons. Number one, migration is going to come back to Vancouver. We're going to see that in general, many migrants are comfortable living in condos and in small quarters. You know, we talk about how crowded it is here in Vancouver, but if you come from a very populous country like China, India, etc., you know, people are used to living in even smaller quarters and more populated areas. And so condo living is very acceptable in those areas. And I think that you'll see a lot more people wanting to move to the downtown cores. Another reason is entertainment is coming back. There's another reason for people to want to be in Vancouver. Jobs, you know, people are going to be asked or forced to start working in that office environment again. You know, a lot of employers have all of this office space and they don't want to be paying for it for nothing, right? So they will start to tell people, hey, you know, I really do want you to start coming back to the office now. And all of a sudden, if you are living out in Chilliwack, you're going to start to realize, oh, right, that's why nobody wants to live in Chilliwack, because you have to have an hour and 15 or an hour and a half commute each way, right? So I think we're going to see a lot of people moving back to the urban centers. Last thing too is with COVID becoming less of a factor, you're gonna have less people worrying about touching door handles and all of that. All that aside too, what I saw in 2016 was that the detached market was running through the roof. It was super hot, and then the townhomes started to come up. And then all of a sudden, this new stress test at the time came out in 2016. And then we saw that there was a bit of a deflation in valuations of detached real estate. But for 2 more years, the condo market continued to increase. And the reason for that is that detached had run up so high that even when it came down, there's still such a wide gap between condos and detached homes. And we saw that the condos slowly inch towards and just close that gap a little bit. I think we're going to see that moving forward. I'm just starting to see now townhomes that are priced right, moving really quick, multiple offers, backup offers, et cetera. I'm just starting to see now that condos are starting to move even in the low end. John has a question. How does a lender qualify an investor for short-term rental properties such as Airbnb? Lenders don't like to finance Airbnbs. That's the reality of the situation. You generally have to position it as either a vacation home or second home for yourself, or you're purchasing a property. You can use the market rents of what you would get for rent if you were to rent it out on a long-term basis. And so the appraiser can put in a market rents analysis on it. It's never going to be nearly as much as you would get if you were Airbnb-ing it, but at least some lenders will allow us to use that rental income to help you qualify for it. It is much harder, however, for you to refinance an Airbnb later on because it's hard for you to get around the fact that you are Airbnb-ing it. So that becomes a challenge. Jordan has a question. So do fourplexes fit into this game plan? Rent 3 units and live in 1. Yes, fourplexes are great. One consideration is that if you're trying to put less than 20% down, you can put as little as 5% down on 1 or 2 unit properties. But if you're buying a 3 or a 4 unit property, the minimum down payment increases up to 10% down. So I do really like the strategy of buying a fourplex, living in 1, renting out the other 3. In many cases, you rent out the other 3 and you live for free. It's a pretty cool experience, and I have a lot of clients that are in that situation. But keep in mind, if you're trying to put the minimum down payment down, you may not be able to do it with 5% down. You may have to put 10% down if it's a 3 or 4plex. Sean has a question. Purchasing properties number 2 and 3, would you use only HELOC? What about servicing the new debt of the HELOC? Could lenders refuse based off on potential rental income? So absolutely, yes, that is a factor. And you know, if you're using a HELOC to buy your rental properties later on, you are leveraging 100% of the asset value of the property that you're purchasing. So it can be very tricky and difficult for you to be able to qualify to build a real estate portfolio that way. However, it is still the recommended strategy is to take all of your savings, pay down your non-tax deductible debt, and minimize your personal mortgage payment, and then increase that line of credit as you continue to invest. And that in general is the best way to do that, especially from a tax perspective. But of course, if you're borrowing money from a HELOC, that money does have to be debt serviced, and it will make it harder than if you just had cash that you're using to invest. But the way to look at that, take the cash, pay down the personal non-tax deductible debt, and reborrow it back out. You still owe the same amount of money inside of that facility. except you're just paying less in tax. So I still recommend, even if you have cash to invest, pay down your personal non-tax deductible mortgage and then reborrow it back out in the line of credit portion and invest that. Adele's a question: if you use a $200,000, if you have used 200 grand on a HELOC and interest is $15 per day, how much principal should you paying to service this if your rental is minimal cash flow? So in general, you want to make sure that you eliminate all of your non-tax deductible debt first. So before you're paying anything off, if you borrow 200 grand on a HELOC to invest, you should be paying down first your non-tax deductible debt. Because any tax deductible debt, keep in mind, even if the interest rate is 3%, but your cost, you're writing that interest cost off, if you're at a 40% tax bracket, then really your effective rate of interest on borrowing that money in the line of credit is only 1.8% because you're effectively writing off 40% of that expense. And so we always recommend pay off your non-tax deductible debt first, and then start chipping away at the tax deductible debt if you have no other non-tax deductible debt. If you have no non-tax deductible debt, then you start to chip away at whatever the highest cost debt is. And so if your line of credit is higher cost, then chip away at that. One of the strategies a lot of our clients will do though is, Adele, if you're borrowing that 200 grand and you have no intention of paying it off anytime soon, just lock it in and convert it to a mortgage. You'll get 2.25% to 1.5% interest on that money. And now you're paying less. You are paying more in a total payment because you're paying principal and interest. But again, remember, if it's part of that whole HELOC, any payment on the principal is increasing the line of credit limit for you. So a nice balance of limiting the payments, but also limiting the amount of payments that you're putting down towards tax deductible debt is to just lock in your borrowed investment portions into mortgage portions. And then you'll get a better rate than a line of credit rate on it. And how much income for an $850 total mortgage with a $1,400 income suite using a credit union like Van City? Good question. So a credit union like Van City, Blue Shore Credit Union, Coast Capital is not quite the same, but it ends up being a kind of similar to a 90% offset. Effectively, if I take $1,400 a month times 0.9, they'll use about $1,250 a month in rent on that. Right now, with this new stress test, payments per 100 grand are about $550 a month using the stress test. That means that we're probably needing to qualify for about $650. You probably need about a $130,000 a year income to qualify for an $850 mortgage with the $1,400 suite using a credit union. That's the quick math on it. And with a major bank, you'd probably need more like 160 or 150 in income. Sharon has a question. Did you mention buying a residence is easier than buying an investment property if I'm self-employed? Does this apply to the second and third rental or a third property? It absolutely does, Sharon. Thanks for bringing that up. If you're buying a residence, in general, there are additional programs available for people that are self-employed. So there are stated income mortgages. There are corporate net income programs. There's a couple of programs where if you're self-employed and you show a very low income on paper, there are better options available purchasing a residence than there are buying a rental. A lot of time if you have a client that's self-employed and has a low reported income, but their business is earning really good income, and we could qualify them under stated income, which means that we state the amount that they're earning and then back that up with good paperwork and a good explanation. It can make a lot more sense to purchase a residence and then turn it into a rental and then buy another residence, turn it into a rental and continue that. There are less programs available when you're purchasing a rental property versus buying a residence. Question about thoughts on joint venture partnerships with limited income. Would it be easier to set up a sole proprietor business account for cash flow properties in Edmonton or buy a residence with my partners in Vancouver? Well, it depends on the partner. So if you're doing a joint venture with partners in Vancouver, that would be a residence. That gets a little bit messy because you're living in the property, and so how do you account for that? That could get a little bit tricky. Setting up a sole proprietor business account for cash flow properties in Edmonton. Yeah, it kind of depends. If you're planning on buying one or two properties with these individuals, with these joint venture partners, I would say that it may make sense for you just to do this and just do this as sole proprietor or partnership. But if you're planning on doing a lot of deals with these people, then I would look at considering setting up a company. Whatever you do when you set up a joint venture, make sure you do a joint venture agreement. There's a number of things that you should address if you're getting into a business relationship with somebody else, and you want to address what happens if somebody gets hit by a bus, what happens if somebody wants to get bought out, what happens if this, what happens if that. You address all of it up front, make sure that everybody agrees, and then proceed from there. Adela asks, is it worth it to put more cash down to obtain cash flow closer to Metro Vancouver? It can make sense and maybe not at the same time. So keep in mind that if you put more down payment, your return on investment from appreciation and other things will start to dwindle and decrease because you're putting more cash into that deal just to force it to work. Sometimes, depending on the structure, if you're thinking, no, I really want to invest in a major urban center and I just need to be able to qualify and you need to hit those debt coverage ratio requirements, then we may advise a client goes in with 40% down and just buys a few properties that way. But Adele, it's important when you run the numbers on the return on investment, your return on investment will start to shrink as a percentage. Because let's say if you bought something with 20% down and 1% of appreciation is, or let's say that the property value goes up by 3% per year, your return on investment from appreciation would be 15%. But if you put 40% down on that property, your return on investment from the appreciation goes from 15% down to 7.5% per year. Your cash flow will bump up a little bit, might go from 2% to 4%, but your return from the appreciation would go from 15 down to 7.5. So something to keep in mind. And in general, usually try to get the maximum leverage you can. And maybe I'm biased. I'm a mortgage broker. I get paid by giving people debt, but I do believe that the return on investment is generally higher if you can obtain more debt. Caitlin has a question. We got a mortgage in December with a readvanceable mortgage option. The property is appreciated approximately $100,000 as it was a pre-sale. When can this capital be accessed? Can you provide a brief description for a readvanceable mortgage? So in general, lenders will usually not allow you to refinance within the first year of ownership. So you may have to wait a year, but you could either go back to your current bank or you can go to another lender. There are a few lenders that can actually refinance for the current value, not and they don't have to wait for an entire year. We're doing one right now where the client bought a property just 2 months ago and we're refinancing it for the current market value, not what they paid for it. So that is possible, but very few lenders will do that. A readvanceable mortgage is a HELOC, and what it means is that you can readvance the principal you've paid down. So every dollar you pay down on the principal, you can reborrow that money out on the line of credit. All right, another question. Would it be better for me to buy a threeplex as a home since I'm self-employed with a low net income? Yes, that's a good point, Genevieve, because if you buy a personal residence, there are more options for stated income and for self-employed programs available to you. And you might find that it's easier for you to qualify for a personal residence that happens to have a couple suites in it. So sometimes that is a good strategy for you to buy a property that has rental income. And you're kind of combining buying rental properties and buying a personal residence together. But because that is your primary residence and has suites in it, now you can qualify for better financing programs because it's owner occupied. So that is a strategy that a lot of our self-employed clients will do. Alejandro has a question. What are the pros and cons of refinancing 1 or 2 years after getting a mortgage instead of the common 5-year? So just keep in mind that if you're refinancing and taking it to a new lender, if you're in a fixed rate mortgage in general, the penalties can be quite high. You have either 3 months interest or what's called an IRD, or interest rate differential penalty. That IRD penalty can often be 5 to 10 times more expensive than the 3-month interest penalty. Now, if you're in a variable rate mortgage, the penalty is only 3 months interest. And that's actually why most of our investor clients generally go variable. Not only over a long period of time have we observed that the variable rate mortgage has been better for our clients. And of course, in an environment where interest rates continue to drop, of course, you'd assume that variable rate mortgages would outperform fixed rate mortgages. However, it's the penalties that really nail people. And if you have to pay a $25,000 penalty instead of a $3,000 penalty to break that mortgage and go somewhere else, especially because policies with lenders change all the time, and it's often that you have to take your mortgage somewhere else to really max it out. We generally advise a rental or a variable rate in that situation. So the pro is that you could get access to more capital, especially in this kind of market where a lot of real estate values have increased. The downside is that especially if you're going to a new lender, you may be paying a penalty instead of waiting until the terms comes up for renewal and then you're open, and then you don't have to pay a penalty to leave that lender and go somewhere else. Okay. Another question, how easy to get a mortgage if the property is being used for Airbnb? So I answered this a little bit earlier, but if the lender understands and knows that it is going to be an Airbnb, it's pretty difficult. So yeah, it is challenging. In general, if you position it as an Airbnb, it's pretty difficult to get qualified. Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Troy. Nice to see you again. Adele asks, how busy is your office right now? It depends how hot the market is. I'll tell you this, Adele, our office is always busy, but I have a lot of staff. And so in the last 15 months, we've hired 9 people. We prefer generally to be a little bit overstaffed than understaffed. That way we can accommodate large fluctuations in applications and whatnot. And we were one of a few brokers that were able to weather the storm back when things were really, really hot a couple of months ago. So I'll say this, the peak for the number of applications coming into our office was in March. That's when we saw the highest number of inquiries of people coming in the door. The peak month for closings was May, and I expect that month we closed 61 transactions. Just to put things in comparison, I'm on track this year to double what we did 2 years ago. If I just take out May and extrapolate that and stretch that type of month out for the entire year and assume that I do those kinds of numbers every single month, I would be quadruple what I did 2 years ago, which it's not fair to isolate 1 month and say, okay, I'm going to stretch that out, because you're always going to have a peak month or two peak months during the year. It is starting to slow down a little bit on the new applications, but we also have a lot of clients that were pre-approved earlier, and now there's a little bit more property hitting the market. I'm finding that more and more clients are hitting. However, the price acceleration is slowing down. Not to say that the price appreciation is not happening, but prices aren't going up by 2 or 5% per month. Maybe they're going up by 1% per month, but I'm still noticing that there is upward pressure on prices, but it's not as drastic as it was a couple of months ago when there's very little product available in the marketplace. Question from Jay, what is liquid assets? So a liquid asset would be TFSA, cash, investments like mutual funds, stocks, bonds, and in general, most lenders will recognize RSPs as liquid investments. Anything in general that you could sell within a couple of days and access would be considered a liquid investment. And so for the purpose of satisfying the banks, 30 grand per property. Yeah, if you have 30 grand of TFSAs or cash, then that's generally good for one property. And again, not all banks require that number. That's more of just a good number to look at achieving, because I find that some banks eventually they say, well, this client does fit the box, but we just feel like they're over leveraged. It's a little bit easier when we're taking a client to the bank and the client has $1 million in investments, and it's for 2 reasons. Number one, it's lower risk because the client could eliminate that mortgage and pay it off, and they have enough liquidity to weather a storm if something was to happen. But number 2, keep in mind the banks are here to make money, and one of the things they look at is when somebody has a large investment pool like that, they think, maybe I can manage those funds on behalf of the client. We can double dip. We can get paid on a mortgage, and we can also see if we can weasel in and start managing that client's assets too. So just keep that in mind, that ultimately at the end of the day, some decisions are made from a risk perspective. Some decisions are made from a profit perspective. Question, when should I start paying down mortgage debt when close to retirement? Here's the cool thing. If you have a home equity line of credit, you're achieving both things of paying down debt and also saving up for investments. Because if you have a HELOC, you can pay down your personal non-tax deductible debt, and that in turn, dollar for dollar, will increase the amount available to you to invest. And so I really like that. If you have all of your non-tax deductible debt paid off, then often what people do as they start to reach retirement, then yes, they start to de-leverage themselves and de-risk themselves. You have less runway to weather storms, and usually people move into safer asset classes. That being said, a lot of our clients are still still carrying those debts or potentially even increasing them, and just parking those investments in safer asset classes, like private lending, for instance, and parking it in debt instead of equity. So instead of buying real estate, maybe they'll lend on it, and they'll lend it out at 8%, and they're only paying 3% on their line of credit. So they're just creating a spread on that difference. So, it's something to consider. Yeah, thanks, Adele. It's great to see you, and thanks for coming out and asking lots of questions and participating. Patrick, you have a question about giving examples of non-tax deductible debt and tax deductible debt. So your mortgage on your personal residence, if you borrowed that money to purchase your own personal residence, or you borrowed money to buy a car for personal use, or you borrowed money to do renovations on your personal house, those are not tax deductible. You cannot write those off. However, if you borrow money with the intention of investing it, then that money is tax deductible. So anytime you borrow money to invest, the interest portion of the payments is tax deductible. Now, I should preface this and say, talk to your accountant. I'm not an accountant. I know a lot about accounting, but I'm not an accountant. It's important to ask an accountant to clarify anything if you have any questions about that. We have a lot of referrals that we can pass off, or introductions, but that would be the easiest example. Is if you're borrowing money to invest, it's tax deductible. If you're borrowing money for personal consumption, it's not tax deductible. All right, if you have a property all paid off and full HELOC available, does that count against you for a brand new mortgage elsewhere, because mortgage is cheaper than HELOC rates? So in general, what our recommendation is number one, that line of credit limit. With some lenders, they're going to look at the limit and debt service you based on that limit. Some lenders will look at as debt servicing you based on the balance, which is 0. So in your case in particular, if you have a pretty fat line of credit limit with a 0 balance on it, you're going to find that with some lenders, your debt servicing is going to be really high, and some lenders are going to be very, very comfortable. So you would need to make sure that you're working with the right lender, and of course, that's where we come in. Now, moving to step number 2, if you now start to borrow money against that line of credit and then use it to invest, usually what I tell people is, if you want money available for the future that you don't have a current need for, keep that on the line of credit, because you don't pay interest on it until you use it. But then when you do borrow it for an extended period of time, then it makes sense to often convert that into a mortgage term. And usually we recommend a closed variable rate. So it's still variable and the rate will fluctuate over time, but you're going to get a prime minus mortgage instead of a prime plus mortgage, like on the line of credit. So as an example, on a personal residence right now, you might be paying prime plus 0.5 on a line of credit, but prime minus 1% on a mortgage. There's a 1.5% spread on that money. So per 100 grand that you're borrowing on a line of credit, instead of locking into a mortgage, you're paying $1,500 extra in interest per year that you could be saving by just converting that into a mortgage. And we see sometimes clients have $500,000 owing on a line of credit that they could convert to a mortgage, and could be saving themselves $7,500 per year in interest costs just by converting that. So something to consider. So keep money available to you on the line of credit for future borrowing. But if you are borrowing money now or very soon for an extended period of time, then I usually recommend converting that into a mortgage. Awesome. So I probably had some questions in the chat too. So I'm just going to read these and see if I've answered some of these already. So I'll start to go through that. But it is easier for me to manage the Q&A if anybody has any other questions. So the question from Yang: if a buyer owns 2 single houses and it's 2 single homes and bought a pre-sale condo, already paid 25% deposit, how much mortgage can they have for closing? Can you provide a form simply shows how much income needs for how much percentage down payment? So it's not a percentage down payment question, Yang. It's more about it's more of a question of how much money are they borrowing in total. I often, if things get complicated, we actually have a spreadsheet we can email out to clients to have them fill in, and then we put it into our master spreadsheet internally, and it'll very quickly, without you having to send in documents and everything, we can very quickly assess your situation and let you know, yes, you have enough income, or this is how much income you need in order to qualify for this situation. So it's hard to answer without knowing the exact amounts owed, and also the rental income on the properties, and there's a couple of houses mixed in. So that's a tough question to answer. Question in the Q&A: would there be a scenario where you can't renew your mortgage because of a job loss? If so, what would be the backup plan? 99 out of 100 times, the bank will renew your mortgage without even looking at your credit, looking at your situation. In fact, we have some clients that got a mortgage 5 years ago that can't qualify to even have the mortgage that they have today. And I'll still tell them, hey, I can get you this rate somewhere else. Go negotiate with your lender and try to fight for a better interest rate. And they do that, and then they get a better interest rate on the renewal. And we just basically help them negotiate with their lender because they don't go through their full credit adjudication process. But as soon as you want to borrow $1 extra on that mortgage, you have to go through the requalification process. So unless it's with a private lender or somebody else like that, generally speaking, major banks will automatically renew you every year without issue. Somebody earlier asked if what I was referencing was a Smith maneuver, and yes, I was mentioning the Smith maneuver, that HELOC product. Let's see here. Somebody was asking me if it's better to do a lump sum payment per year or pay an extra 15% per month and effectively do the same thing. So you could do a lump sum every year. You could also do it every month. Doing it every month is a little bit more labor intensive. The only financial difference is if you do it every month, you're going to have a little less principal owing on the next month's interest that accrues. So if you do it on an annual basis versus a monthly basis, you might end up paying maybe $10 or $20 more in interest cost, maybe $50 a year in interest cost. So you have to balance out what's the administration cost of your time versus the amount of actual interest you're saving. Let's see here. I'm just checking to see if there's any other items. One question, do you start with alternative lenders or regular bank lenders to avoid the 5 property cap? So that's a good question. In general, we usually use non-bank lenders for your first 5 properties. And then we switch into using often major banks for later. So we like to save the major banks for later whenever possible. Or there's some major banks that just aren't good for 5+ properties. And so sometimes we use major banks for those first 5. So it just depends on the situation. But there's some lenders that are really good for properties number 6 to 10. It's better to preserve them for later if at all possible. Let's see here. A couple questions about cash flowing properties in Vancouver, and we definitely talked about that too. Let's see here. What areas are good to invest with $150,000 to $200,000 HELOC? It's a good question. There's a lot of different things that you could invest in. If you didn't want to qualify at all for the new mortgage and you just want to buy something with cash, then 150 to 200 grand isn't going to qualify you for a lot. You'd probably be looking at smaller markets, or you could be looking at maybe doing a joint venture. And there's a lot of joint venture opportunities out there to invest and go in with other people and be part of a larger group buying a apartment building or something like that. So if you want to learn more about opportunities like that, then just send me an email, and I'm happy to help. Let's see here. Rag has a question. So if I have a primary residence that I bought this year, how can I know how much the property has appreciated in 1 year? In general, the most accurate way to do this is to actually talk to your realtor and get that information. There is another website, and I can't remember the name of it, but I was just looking at it the other day. There's another website that has fairly accurate data on home valuations, but I just can't remember the name of it. If you email me, Ragu, I might be able to dig into my emails and see if I can find it, and I can email that out to you. William has a question. I am a bit confused on how to use my HELOC. Can I use the HELOC for 100% of the down payment, which means 100% borrowed money for investing, or should I use a bit of cash plus HELOC for down payment? So William, our recommendation in general from a tax perspective is use all of the down payment from the HELOC for your down payment, and then you're borrowing 100% of the asset value. Again, it can be harder for you to qualify to do that, but in general, if you took that cash you had sitting on the side and paid down your personal mortgage, then you're still borrowing the same amount in total in that situation. So we do generally recommend borrowing all of your down payment. Okay, so I have another question. If I have 5 rental properties and I paid off 2 of them, does it count that I have 3 or 5? It depends, actually. It depends on the lender you talk to. Most lenders, however, will say that you have 5 properties, not 3. I had a client who is an accountant, very strong borrower. He owned 8 properties in total. 2 of them had mortgages on them. The other 6 did not. And I was trying to get one extra mortgage for him on a rental property. And the lenders came back and said, sorry, this client has more than 5 properties. And I said, yes, but almost all of them are paid off. And they said, yeah, sorry, here's our box. You have to fit into it. So it can be quite frustrating that you can't make those types of deals happen. But many lenders do look at that and they'll say, well, sorry, you still have 5 properties. A few lenders, though, will look at the number of mortgages you have, but most will still look at the total number of properties. Okay. So there's a question when you mention income, does it mean employment income? And the answer is yes. When I'm mentioning income, I am generally mentioning income. Lenders would use employment income. If you own a business, what you draw out of it as a salary or a dividend. If you have investment income, we can often use that as long as you're not using those same investments for down payment. And incomes that we can't usually use would be things like capital gains, because capital gains are not expected to continue on an ongoing basis. So something to consider there. Question. So this might be an accounting question, but if you use the HELOC to buy a pre-sale condo, can you use the HELOC interest payment as an investment expense? And the answer is yes. So if you use the HELOC, you're borrowing money to invest. You can use that that interest cost. You can write that off. Okay. Let's see here. I'm just going to see. There's another question about what I think about the Fort St. John and Dawson Creek market. I actually invested quite a bit in Fort St. John and Dawson Creek. It's hard to say what's going to happen there. I am seeing signs that things are going to improve, but I do think that it needs more time. I still think that Fort St. John and Dawson Creek might be a few years away from where they'll be extremely profitable. May mean that it could be a good area to consider investing in, but I still think it might be a couple of years away yet. I've got another question from Wendell. So when you say a person has 5 properties, what if all 5 are in a holding company that the person is 100% or 50% owner? So that's a good question. Often what it comes down to is, depending on the lender, it depends on what properties are reporting on your credit bureau or what mortgages are reporting on your credit bureau. So here's the reality of the situation. You're supposed to disclose all of your holdings of your properties, but if you're purchasing in company names, sometimes this is where things can more easily get missed, because if you didn't disclose it to the bank and it doesn't show up in your credit bureau, then it may not show up anywhere. So that can be a way of effectively hiding properties from the banks. But that when you say, if a person has 5 properties in general, it should apply to everything that you own. Celine has a question. If you have a HELOC on your personal residence and you use the money to invest using the Smith maneuver, isn't that going to lower your borrowing power for purchasing rental property? Of course it is, but ultimately at the end of the day, if you took all of, if you balance everything out, if you had some money in a HELOC available to you and some cash available to you to invest, if you took your cash, paid down your non-tax deductible debt, reborrowed it right back out in the HELOC, and then use that for the down payment on an investment property, you're still borrowing the same amount. Like if you have a $200,000 mortgage and a $100,000 line of credit, and you have 100 grand in cash, if you pay down your mortgage by 100 grand and increase your line of credit by 100 grand, so now you have a 100 grand mortgage and 200 grand line of credit, you still borrow $300,000 here. It's the same number. So it doesn't really affect anything. It's just shifting around how much of it is tax deductible and how much is not. But of course, if you're borrowing a lot of money, then that all has to be debt serviced, and you have to have enough income to be able to do that. Okay, John has a question. B&B is like a hotel. So B&B or Airbnb. Airbnb is a bit different, because in general, you're just giving people access to use the property as they wish. B&B or bed and breakfast is more like running a hospitality business where people are usually living on site and providing breakfast and things like that. That's why they call it bed and breakfast. So it's a bit different than an Airbnb, where you're really just renting it as a short-term rental, which is a bit different. Let's see here. And question, Airbnb is like a hotel or motel. It can be considered that way when you're trying to get financing, especially if you're already operating it as such. So again, Airbnbs can be hard to finance, especially in this type of climate. Let's see here if any other questions. Question, do we finance Ontario properties? I have one coming up in 7 months, and I'm not sure if I go with the bank for my third property. Yeah, Mary, we can definitely help you with that. Feel free to reach out, and we can go into some discussion about that. Most of our business is done, I mean, we do deals from BC over to Ontario, but most of our business is done in BC, Alberta, and Ontario. So, of course, being located in Vancouver, a lot of our clients are from Vancouver, but because we're investor based, and that's our niche, about 80% of our client base are investors, we help clients across the country. I had a client here, or a question here, which lender is more friendly to self-employed? Really tough to answer that question. There are some special programs though that are available. I've been doing a lot lately with Manulife and Scotiabank, just because they have a couple of programs that I've found to be very useful to us. And other than that, it varies quite a bit. A lot of lenders do have self-employed programs. Some of them are better than others, but it really depends. Selena has a question. I have a few Airbnbs which are generating good income, and I want to purchase the next rental property. How can I position my Airbnb rental income to lenders? Good question. So this really depends. In general, Selena, lenders are more likely to use the rental income on short-term rentals if you at least have 1 to 2 years of tax returns filed showing that income. If you just bought the Airbnb, it makes it a lot more difficult to be able to use income on it. Some lenders will then use a market rent done by an appraiser in lieu of that. But in general, most of the time we find that if you're operating Airbnbs, we usually need the income to show up in the T1 generals. So the lenders have a good annual snapshot of how much income to be able to use on that. Let's see here. I'm just going to see if there's any other questions. Just a question about the self-employed programs and what they look like. So one in particular is something called corporate net income. And effectively what the lenders do is if you own a corporation, and let's say the corporation's profit was $200,000 and you only took home a $50,000 dividend, there's still $150,000 remaining inside the company that was a profit and it was retained earnings. In those cases, we have some lenders that we use a percentage or even all of that extra money that was retained inside of the company. So we can use a percentage of that $150,000 that was retained inside the corp. So sometimes we can add more income to your income to help you qualify. There are also programs that allow for higher debt service ratios if you're self-employed. So instead of only allowing to use 44% of your income to debt service, they'll allow you to use 70% of your income to debt service. Their rates are slightly higher under that program, but not as high as what we would call B lenders, which is often the lenders that the brokers will go to if they can't get it done in the A lending side of things. So, you know, like a 0.25%, I think it is, higher than their standard mortgage rate for those types of programs. So not a lot more expensive, but a little bit more expensive. And then with minimum 10% down for an owner-occupied property, you can get a stated income mortgage. And stated income means that we reverse engineer how much you need to qualify, or how much income you need in order to qualify for what you want. And so instead of saying, here's your income, this is what you qualify for, we reverse it and we say, what do you want to qualify for? This is how much income you need in order to be able to qualify for that. And then we see if it's reasonable for us to state that you earn that. There's a couple of things that we look at. Is the stated income that we're stating less than your total gross income that you file on your tax return or inside of your corporate financials? Is the amount that we're stating no more than double what your net income is on your notice of assessment, your tax return? There's a couple of factors like that that we look at that aren't black and white, but they're gray zones. The challenge with stated income is not black and white. It is more of an art than a science, but we have a lot of experience dealing with those, and we're very good at selling businesses. We do commercial lending as well as residential lending here. So we're always selling businesses in our office, and stated income does require you to really sell the deal. The better you sell it, the better position you are to be able to get the lender and the mortgage insurer on board. Jenny has a question. If you have amount of HELOC, should use the HELOC as cash to purchase rental properties, or should you use the HELOC as down payment to try and get a mortgage from bank? So You could use the HELOC to just buy the rental properties with cash. And one of the benefits, if you have a big fat HELOC, let's say you have 600 grand available in your line of credit and you're negotiating on a property worth 500, you have the ability, if you want to just write a subject-free offer, because you have very minimal risk that that if you couldn't get a mortgage, you could still just use your line of credit, write a check, and close on the property yourself. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility to be more aggressive on purchasing real estate. That being said, it's not usually advisable, because if you have that $600,000 line of credit, if you bought a $500,000 property and only borrowed $100,000 from the line of credit and then got a $400,000 mortgage on the rental, you still have $500 out of the $600,000 available to you in the line of credit, which means you can still do more investments later on. Whereas if you just bought that property to a little cash, out of that $600,000 line of credit, you're going to use 500 of it to buy the rental. Now you only have $100,000 left. So it's generally a last resort or a tool to be a bit more aggressive in negotiating on a potential purchase. We usually advise, if you can get a mortgage on the rental, get a mortgage on the rental, because then it leaves more cash available for future investments using your line of credit. Yeah, no worries, Jeannie. I had a question. What's your advice to a new investor to start commercial project? What kind of commercial property to start with? So commercial is a completely different ball game altogether. We do have a webinar. I have to double check, and I think it's probably on our website, our list and like our timelines for when we're doing that. But we do have a commercial webinar coming up later. But high level, with commercial, you're either qualifying based off of the income that the asset produces, and in general, the income needs to be 1.25 times all of the expenses. We do have a commercial analysis tool available on our website too that can help you reverse engineer how much you'd qualify for on an investment property. The other thing that we look at on commercial is if your business is going to occupy it, then your company could provide a corporate guarantee. It's like providing a cosigner or a guarantee. And then they look at the income that the business generates to help supply and supplement that loan that you're seeking. And that's another way of you being able to qualify for that loan. So lots of moving parts here. If you're just generally asking what kind of commercial investments I like multifamily. So anything that's 5+ units, residential, is considered a commercial loan. And the other thing that I'm very keen on too is warehouses. A lot more products are being shipped and delivered online, and so warehouses are becoming more and more relevant in today's world. And I think the industrial land is increasing in price. It already has increased, and I don't know if we've missed the boat on that or not, but I still think there's going to be upward pressure on that investment class. I have a question here. If you own 2 rentals with other investors and have mortgages on them, are there any lenders that take into consideration 50% owned as 100% owned for payment of debt servicing? So the answer is no. And we actually did have, for a period of time, we had some lenders that would only take 50% of the rent and then apply their own rental policies on top of that, but still take 100% of the debt, which really sucked. The problem with that is that they're not going to assume that you are only a 50% owner of that and therefore only responsible for 50% of the debt, because the true fact is you are not only responsible for 50% of the debt. If your other partner does not pay the mortgage payment, do you think the bank's going to call you and ask you for 50% of the payment or 100% of the payment? The reality is you've co-signed for 100% of that debt, and therefore the lender is going to ask you for 100% of that payment. And so lenders do not shrink the amount based off of the percentage ownership that you have of the real estate. If you own it and you're on the title, you're on the mortgage 100%, and they just assume 100% of the income, 100% of the debt, and then they factor in their percentage of rental income to determine the debt servicing. Okay. Quick question. Do lenders include unused HELOC as debt when calculating the mortgage? Some lenders do include unused HELOC, so a HELOC limit, not just the balance, but the limit. Some lenders do factor that in when you're qualifying for future debt, but there are some lenders that do not include the HELOC limit. They just look at the balance. How do lenders view agreement for sale contracts before the property closes? Since the mortgage is in the seller's name, will that count against you as the buyer or not? So generally, an agreement for sale means that you have the ability to purchase that property, but you are not currently on the mortgage, and therefore you're not currently on title. So, this does not typically show up or count against you in any way. So, agreement for sale is a way of potentially not saddling yourself with too much debt in your personal debt servicing. All right. See if any of your questions. If you have your principal mortgage or principal home mortgage free and multiple rental properties with mortgages, does it affect your borrowing if you gift it to your children for future planning and still live there compared to still in your name and living there? Interesting. Okay. So I think the question is, if I have a residence that I live in right now, if I gift it to my children and then still live in it, would that affect my ability to qualify in the future? So there's a couple of moving parts. If it's in your name and has no mortgage on it, if it has a line of credit, some lenders will look at the limit, some lenders will look at the balance. So it may or may not negatively impact you there. Now, even owning a property with no mortgage on it, you still have property taxes and you still have heating. So there's some payment that has to be associated with that. Now, if you do not own a residence in your own name and you're living in a place, living there rent-free in the family home, for instance, we do have this where maybe a husband and wife combination, one person lives in the property, one person and owns it, and the other person lives in it and does not own it. You still have to factor in what's called a living expense. And that living expense is generally about $800 per month to $1,000 a month. So what you would have to weigh out is the property taxes and heating cost of living in this property with no mortgage on it, is that higher than paying $800 or $1,000 a month? And you might find that it might be about the same. So it might not really affect your borrowing power significantly either direction. Awesome. I think I've answered everything and I'm starting to lose my voice a little bit. So I think what I'll do is I'll wrap it up here, guys. It was great to see everybody here. I think at the peak at one point, I think we had about 140 people out at the webinar. I'm really enjoying doing these, and it's giving me an opportunity to chat with current clients, people that are not our clients, some people that are our past clients, and so it's great to see a lot of familiar faces, so to speak, here. Thanks for coming out, and I hope to see you next month at our next webinar. Thanks so much, guys. Bye now.